Very warm welcome to all the audience. And this time our book under discussion is Sunnis and Shi'a, a political history by Laurence Louër, who is an Arabist and an associate professor at the Center for International Studies Sciences. First of all, let's come to the plus points of this book. Actually, the book highlights three themes, but mostly the two themes on which the book is structured are divergence and convergence between the two factions called Sunnis and Shias within the mainstream Islam. As far as the divergence is concerned, the writer historically traces the differentiation between imamate and caliphate, which is the main starting point from where the difference between the faction starts, not really historically, but after the advent of Islam. Linguistically, word imam means the one who precedes, whereas caliph means one who comes after. So the role of imam is actually a divinely inspired person from the family of the Prophet Muhammad, and the role of imam is to reveal the secrets and hidden meaning of the message conveyed to the Prophet. Now, this role is largely religious in nature, whereas the role of a caliph is political as well as religious in the beginning, as far as the four rightly guided caliphs of Islam are concerned. But later on, the formation of dynasties and the role became both political and religious. As far as the Shia side is concerned, the Fatimids, who are directly descendants of the daughter of the Prophet Fatima and her husband Ali, they conquered Egypt and they formed the Fatimid dynasty there. Till 11th century, when the split between Ismailis occurred and they moved to Iran, and there was a creation of another sect within Fatimids by the name of Nazaris, this particular form of governance of the Shia state continued. The convergence of the two sects is basically on two bases. This is what the writer highlights, and this is a good point, that the convergence comes, number one, from mystical sources, because the role of son-in-law of the Prophet Ali is of supreme importance, and both the sects, Sunnis and Shias, especially the Sufi side of Sunnism, adhere to the rituals and practices which are mostly spiritual in nature, like karama and like vilaya. Their beliefs and their practices and their rituals are very, very similar. As far as the political convergence is concerned, the credit for that goes to Imam Jafar Sadiq, who in 8th century, because of his very close relationship with Abbasid caliphs, integrated the office of imamate with that of religious scholars, and these religious scholars later became Sunni ulama. The third theme is actually tracing the history of Shia-Sunni convergence and divergence to this day. And there are certain countries which the writer selects, and out of those countries, Iraq is the one. And in Iraq, the 16th century battle between the Safavids and the Ottoman is highlighted, which created a permanent fault line between the two sects, which is evident till day. Bahrain is situated between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the old fault line separating Safavids and Ottoman is exhibited in that country as well. Pakistan was largely free of sectarian violence till 1990s, when the sectarian nature of violence actually escalated and radical groups on both sides were formed. And the writer attributes these to the Islamization project of Ziaul Haq and his very close proximity with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran, they both represent themselves as champions of Sunni and Shia Islam respectively. They are in a state of Cold War since 1979. Yemen, which is a house of Zaydi's faction of Shia, has seen civil war since 2004, which intensified in 2014, and this civil war is largely sectarian in nature. Similarly, Lebanon, which was in civil war since 1975, which ended in 1990, and this civil war shattered the traditional Islamo-Christian integration and brought the Shia community into the political equation. And since then, Shia-Sunni discord has become an organizing principle of the politics. The writer concludes, and in conclusion, he highlights two basic lessons. One lesson is that Shia Sunnis share a relation of mimetic rivalry, and he defines mimetic rivalry as a combination of differences as well as imitation. Differences are already highlighted in detail in our discussion under divergence, but the imitation is that the Sufic Sunnis, as far as the mystic practices are concerned, they are rather imitations of the Shias, whereas state-wise, the Safavid model of state was exactly in the lines of Ottoman model of state. So this mimetic rivalry has, according to the writer, persisted till date. Second lesson to be learned from the political history of both sects is that the relationship between the two exhibit classic features of minority-majority relations. Because globally, Shias are demographically in minority, and wherever they are in majority, they are still in minority as far as politics is concerned. Now, this is because of the historical marginalization of the Shias from the mainstream Islam. Because Sunnis are always in majority, so they consider Shiaism as an embodiment of difference or sometimes as deviance. But nation states have generally exercised a very high degree of pragmatism, and there is hardly any incident of ethical cleansing or mass deportation of the minorities except in the case of Iraq. Now, some of the points which are not mentioned in the book and which I will highlight as critique on the work. Number one is that in the discussion of subcontinental Islam, the convergence of two factions or the divergence of two factions is not traced really to the contemporary differences. By that I mean the differences between various factions of Shias, 12ers, the 7ers, the 5ers, the Ismailis and the Zaydis and the mainstream Shias, with the various divisions within the Sunni school of thought like Barelvis, Deobandis. These frictions or convergences are not fully explored, and it would have been much forceful if the writer had highlighted the Sunni Barelvi school of thought and its similarities in many ways to the mystical or religious traditions and rituals with Shia section. Now, the writer also misrepresents the reasons for creation of Pakistan and attributes the creation purely to political and national factors. There is no mention of two-nation theory, which was the base on which Pakistan was created, and there is no mention of Jinnah. The founder of the country is portrayed as a rather secular figure, and there is no mention of his speeches after 1932, which were largely focused on the creation of a welfare Islamic state. And that is a big miss, because the whole idea of Pakistan seems to be diminished by this attribution of it to the formation of a mere nation for Muslims where Muslims will live separately. Because Muslims, even in India, not really today, but some 10 years ago, were quite free to worship, were quite free to say prayers, were quite free to go to Hajj or keep fast. If that was the purpose of creating Pakistan, then actually there was no forceful spirit behind it. But the real reason for creation of Pakistan are, in my opinion, glossed over by the writer. Similarly, the converging and diverging perspective of Shias and Sunnis regarding the parents of Imam Mahdi and its connect with today's political scene depicted in both Sunnis and Shias' version of Hadith are not highlighted. And there is a chain of mystics like the 14th century mystic Nehmatullah Shah Wali, whose prophecies in this regard are also not highlighted. So apart from these misses, generally it's a good book because it gives a good history, a good account of history of the sectarian differences between the two sects, though it does not trace them back to the period which was before Prophet Muhammad, but it nevertheless gives a good account of how Imamate and Caliphate were different and how this difference has existed and survived over centuries and how it is manifesting even in today's world.